There's a lot of riders that have switched between these two bikes, but looking at the spec sheet doesn't tell you the whole story. So let me tell you my experience on these bikes. Hey, how's it going? Welcome to my channel. As I said in the intro, I have seen quite a few comments from people transitioning from the KTM 390 Adventure to the Yamaha Tenere 700, and I've even seen some transition from the Yamaha Tenere 700 down to the KTM 390 Adventure. Now, there are some reasons to go both ways. There are some things that are very similar, but there are some drastic differences as well. And to give you an idea, outside of the spec sheet, what you will find with these two bikes. I need to apologize. I live out in the country. There are dogs going nuts. This is the only time I have to film, so hopefully it's not too distracting. So spec sheet wise, I'll let you guys figure all those things out. But what do these bikes actually feel like in riding and experience, and maybe which one is the better one for you and the type of riding you do? So let's get to that. Real quick, I want to cover some of the common reasons that I have seen why people have transitioned from the 390 over to the Tenere 700, and that is power, ground clearance, suspension travel, and wheel size. So those are basically the #1 reasons why I see people transition from one to the other. Now, transitioning from the T7 down to the 390, the reasons people are doing that is seat height, entry level cost, and weight. Weight is a big factor for people wanting to go to this smaller bike. So with that in mind, let's talk about some of the other things that don't show up on the spec sheet. Now, full disclosure, my KTM 390 Adventure is far from stock. I've done a ton of modifications to it. I have probably put enough money into this bike from its initial cost that it would exceed the purchase price of this bike. And I haven't regretted it. I've enjoyed wrenching on the bike, but this is much, much different. So I'm gonna be relating it more to the stock base model and just some basic things that you can do to get it to fit you a little bit better. So keep that in mind. Now, one of the things that I have noticed between these two bikes is because the wheelbase on this bike, the 390 Adventure, is shorter than the T7, it just feels more nimble. It's more nimble on the road, it's more nimble in parking lots, it's definitely more nimble off-road. So what I have found, even with the modifications that I've done to include the fork extensions, is that it's easier to pick a line and weave through things on this bike than it is this bike. Some of that also has to do with the weight, because this bike weighs a little less and the weight is distributed more centrally over the bike and it's not top heavy like this bike. It's just a little easier to pick my way through different lines, off-road, rocky stuff. If I need to turn this bike around, I need a smaller space to do that, which is great, especially with all the filming that I do. So really one of the first things to keep in mind is this is gonna be a more nimble bike than the T7, which, depending on the type of terrain you're riding and the type of riding you do and where you're gonna be, if you find yourself in dead ends or just wanna be able to maneuver the bike better, this, in my opinion, is a little bit easier to ride. We can talk about power numbers between the two bikes. Obviously, this is more powerful, but do you really need it? So it has been my experience in most of the riding conditions, like 90% of them, this has more than enough power. The only time that I've really found that it doesn't have enough power is really, really steep grades up in the mountains where I might be struggling to keep it at 55, 60 miles per hour, or really, really strong headwinds. Then this bike gets blown around on the road and can't necessarily go straight through those headwinds and maintain speed. Where the bigger power and the more weight, it's able to handle the heavy, heavy winds, and I never really have to worry about power going up and over passes. So benefit here if you're doing a lot of road riding, especially in windy areas, if you live out in the west, along the Rocky Mountains, New Mexico, Arizona, even in the plains of California, the eastern side of California, the winds can be horrendous. Having that little bit of extra weight is helpful. This bike, I've gotten blown all over the place, but it doesn't happen all the time. There is a benefit to being on this bike over this one because of those issues of steep hills and heavy winds. Another thing that doesn't show up in the spec sheet is ergonomics of these two bikes. I think this bike in its stock form requires quite a bit of modification, especially if you're a taller person. I think if you're 5'8", 9, 10, or much taller than that, you're gonna have to make some modifications with probably lower pegs, taller seat, and likely bar risers just to make it more comfortable overall. So you're gonna be spending money on that. So just know, if you get this bike, the ergonomics from it being stock, not great. Now this bike, I actually didn't find the ergonomics to be as bad as this one, but I ended up modifying them. I know there's a lot of complaints with this bike with the handlebars being a little too straight. There's not enough bend in them. I find those to be okay, but with the seat height being as high as it is, I put a lower seat, which cramped up my knees. So I had to drop the pegs. And then of course the windscreen is up. I made some modifications to that to get a little bit better wind protection. So from that standpoint, ergonomics, I think both of these bikes, for me and the way that I ride, they needed modifications. I think it's more expensive on this one because of the modifications that I did, but I don't think either of these right off the factory floor, if you're 5'10" or more, depending on what you're trying to do, are gonna necessarily fit you. So just expect with both of these bikes, you're gonna need to make some changes. All right, if you look at the spec sheet, you'll see that the suspensions are quite a bit different with the amount of travel. But I actually think the suspension, stock suspension on this bike, works better than the T7. The T7 is very soggy. This is also, the front forks are a little bit soggy, but not as bad. And really, I think most riders can get away with just doing springs on this. You don't necessarily need to replace the rear shock. The rear shock seems to work pretty well. There's some other things that you may want to do, but I think in its stock form, the suspension actually works a little bit better on this. It's a little bit stiffer. You don't have as much ground clearance, but even though you have extra ground clearance on this, if you weigh more than 170 pounds, you're carrying any luggage, you're gonna be blowing through that travel. So whatever extra ground clearance that you've gained with more travel, you're just gonna be using it up. So I really think the rolling off the showroom floor, the edge goes to this bike with suspension, just because it is shorter in travel, but it is a stiffer suspension and can handle stuff better. That's just my experience with it. Again, I've modified this a significant amount, and since adding fork springs and shock spring, this has improved. It feels better. But those are things that you're likely gonna have to do with both of these bikes if you're gonna be doing any technical, not even hugely technical, but any off-road riding. It's more than just a hard pack forest roads. These bikes, they're gonna need suspension upgrades. All right, one of the things between these two bikes that may not be apparent from the beginning is the fuel range. The fuel range on these two bikes is significantly different. This bike, I'm only getting 45 to 50 miles per gallon, and the fuel light comes on around 120 to 130 miles, which to me is not a lot of range. Now I know that it has a smaller tank on it, and with that low fuel economy, you're burning through the fuel. So I've always felt like I needed to carry extra fuel with this bike. There's a number of other solutions, a replacement fuel tank. There's the Camel tank that you can put on the back. But right from the beginning, the range on this is very short. Now, this bike is fantastic. I'm getting anywhere from 65 to 70 miles per gallon on this, and my fuel light doesn't come on until about 160, 170. I have gone as far as 210 miles on this bike. So I don't get as nervous riding this bike around. I believe that I will be able to get to the next gas station, and I don't feel compelled to carry extra fuel. With this bike, if I'm out here in the West and I know there's like long distances between fuel stations, I really feel compelled to carry extra fuel just from an emergency standpoint, because this bike just goes through it. Now, part of that could be the way that my right wrist works with this bike. I like power sliding corners and feeling the acceleration, the throttle, the sound out of it. I don't necessarily do that as much with this bike. With the less power, it's a little bit more challenging to power slide it than it is with this one. So maybe that has an effect. But even just road riding at highway speeds, this thing sucks the fuel, where this one has great range. So significant difference depending on how you ride. If you trailer your bike somewhere to ride the forest roads, maybe not a big deal. But if you're doing long distance travel, this is actually a little bit easier to ride for long distance travel than this because of the fuel range. All right, speaking of fuel range, there's also getting fuel in the bike, which between these two bikes, it's just a minor irritation. But I hate putting gas in this bike for two reasons. One is the gas cap comes off, it's separated, so you got to find a place to put it, try not to drop it. But then the fuel, the filler cap area has a very small hole that the gas pump slides down into to get it filled up. And I inevitably splash fuel everywhere, and then I have to pull it out and slowly pump it, which splashes fuel everywhere as well. Now there might be a way of taking that out. There's probably some posts for taking that out. I just haven't looked for it. But I find that to be a huge irritation on this particular bike, trying to get it filled up as much as I can, because I know it's gonna burn through the fuel, and trying to get it to fit in there. Now with this bike, the gas cap flips up and the hole to fill is quite large. So I can just pour and pour and pour. I'm not spilling gas everywhere. And then I can get it pretty full pretty easily without it splashing. Might seem like a small thing, but when you're filling up multiple times a day and you're doing long distance travel, this is faster to fill up, takes less fuel. I can go further. And this is just kind of an irritation that over time, maybe you find kind of a routine for it, but I always am splashing fuel out of this bike. Urgh. All right, another comparison between these bikes that I don't think anyone really talks about or gives a lot of consideration to is this bike is throttle by cable. This bike is throttle by wire. So the 390 is throttle by wire. And I know, because I've heard it, there are some complaints that the throttle by wire isn't as responsive as a throttle by cable, which, okay, I get that, but it's not that big of a difference for me. And what you can do if you have throttle by wire is there are aftermarket cruise control kits that are fairly inexpensive that you can put on a throttle by wire bike, where on the throttle by cable, there's a $800 or $900 cruise control kit to put on. And the reason I'm talking about cruise control is the throttle by cable, the return spring on the throttle bodies on this, it's heavy. And riding all day long, if I'm riding hundreds of miles to get to some place that I want to ride, say like Big Bend National Park, I've got a 700-800 mile ride to get there. It's a lot of highway miles. It's a lot of just holding the throttle. And over time, I feel way more stressed riding this bike because of that throttle return spring weight over this bike, over the throttle by wire, because that return spring is just not as heavy. And it also gives me the ability to use a throttle lock more reliably on this bike over this one. I have a throttle lock, but because that return spring is so heavy, it doesn't hold particularly well. I might get 30, 40 seconds of rest for my wrist and shoulder and elbow on this, where this one I can go long stretches and it'll hold its place. Now, that might not be significant enough for all of you. I've had elbow surgery, my shoulders are in terrible shape, and just over time, it's just a lot of stress put on your body and holding it, and I feel that accumulate over the day. So those are some differences that I've noticed about these two bikes, that if I'm gonna do a long distance travel right now, I would probably take this bike just because it's more comfortable over this one, knowing that the throttle, just holding it, is easier to do here. All right, primary concern that comes up with KTMs is their reliability. That's always an issue that people talk about continuously, and for good reason. I think some of the other bikes have had reliability issues, but this particular bike, I've only had one thing come up that became a warranty issue, and that was the rear shock. I blew out the rear shock. I'm pushing the bike, I'm riding it harder than it was probably intended, and there were some other things that came with it. But I've never been stranded on the side of the road. So as far as I'm concerned, this bike is extremely reliable. I have 28,000 miles, approaching 30, and it's been a fantastic bike for me. Now, obviously, the Yamaha Tenere 700 has a tremendous track record of reliability. So if you're considering this bike over this one because of a reliability issue, there's plenty of people out there that have ridden these for tens of 20,000 miles and have had no issues. Now, of course, there's always a few things that go on with different bikes, and that can be the case with the T7. I've seen comments for both bikes where things have gone terribly wrong. So at least for me, my experience on these bikes, reliability really hasn't been something that I am judging on which bike I take out for a ride. Now, one of the other things that I think needs to be taken into consideration is, you know, depending on how much riding you're planning to do, is maintenance costs. And I don't think that's something that's talked about a lot with bikes and what the ownership costs are going to be. So I will say, like, from an oil change standpoint, you can go about 4,500, 4,700 miles on this bike. It takes 1.7 liters of oil. So over the long term, oil changes with the filters, the replacements of those, it's going to be a little bit cheaper on this bike than this bike. This bike takes almost 3 liters of oil. Now, tire wise, this runs a 19-inch front tire, and I have found that the front tire 19-inch, tends to cost more than the 21-inch front tire. So the tire costs for the front is going to be more on this bike. However, on the rear tire, the 150/70/18 for this bike, the Yamaha Tenere 700, is quite expensive, as opposed to the KTM 390 Adventure, which uses a 130/80/17. I can get a similar tire, the same tire in the size for this bike, for anywhere $40 to $50 less than the size on this bike. And because this bike weighs less, the tires tend to last a little bit longer. So even though the front tires, there's a difference in price, it isn't enough to where tires for the KTM 390 Adventure are going to cost less over the lifetime of the bike than they are on the Tenere 700. Just some things to think about: replacement wheels, things like that. Anything that's damaged, it's going to be more expensive on this bike than this bike, although those are probably going to be fairly similar in cost. So overall, I think over the lifetime of the bike, you'll save a little bit of money on maintenance costs for the KTM 390 Adventure over the Tenere 700, but there's a little bit more frequent maintenance required on this than this bike. The last thing I want to mention is the way these bikes feel. The Tenere 700 feels like a big bike. Physically, it is a bigger bike, and the KTM 390 Adventure, sitting on it, riding it, it feels like a much more compact, smaller bike. And you'll be able to see that with me just sitting on it, those differences. All right, the very last comparison between these bikes is the ability to move these bikes around in the garage. It might seem like a small thing, but after having the R1200 GS for a long time and then moving this bike around compared to this bike, and dropping bikes, trying to maneuver them around, this bike, the Tenere 700, it's more challenging to move around in the garage. The weight distribution is a bit higher. I have to really put my hip into it, and the handlebars are quite high on this bike compared to my 390 Adventure, even with all the modifications. So if I just need to move the 390 around in the garage, just put it in different places, I find this to be a lot easier to move around. And it might seem like a kind of a trivial thing, but I find myself moving bikes around in the garage all the time. So if that's something that you find that you're doing, or you have a very tight space in your garage or your shed or someplace to put your bike, and you want something that's easier to move around, this will be the bike for that. This bike, sometimes I have to muscle it around, and I have dropped it because of that. I've gotten an awkward angle and it's just fallen away from me. So I've never had that happen with this bike, touch wood, but with this bike I have. So just another thing to keep in mind that you won't see on the spec sheet. I need to wrap this video up. It's gone a bit long, but those are my comparisons between these two bikes that are off of the spec sheet, just feels of the bike. Now, if you have switched between these two bikes, let me know what your experience has been in the comments below. If you have any questions regarding both of these bikes and differences between them that maybe I didn't cover, also leave your questions in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Get out, do some riding, ride safe, and I will see you out there.